some trouble getting the packaging open because it was stapled shut, so his father helped him. Timothy complained that it tasted bitter immediately, so Ronald gave him some Kool-Aid to wash it down. Timmy quickly began complaining of stomach pains and started getting very sick. Ronald was holding Timmy in his arms and he went limp. An ambulance came, but he passed away on the way to the hospital. The autopsy found that the pixie sticks Timmy consumed contained enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 adults. People across Texas were told not to eat any judge offered to drive him to the death chamber himself. O'Brien's lawyers tried for a fourth stay of execution on the grounds that lethal injection was cruel and unusual punishment. O'Brien was originally supposed to receive the electric chair, and by this point the Supreme Court had ruled that as cruel and unusual, so the lawyer was clearly grasping at straws here. The judge denied that request on March 28th, and Ronald was scheduled to be executed 3 days later. In the days leading up to his death, countless media outlets would interview O'Brien and cover the story, some from as far away as Japan. A journalist by the name of Tony Pilkington said of O'Brien, quote, "He was working the room. He seemed as comfortable as any politician or PR person I had covered, fielding questions at a press conference. His eyes, like his demeanor, were cold and steely as he stared at reporters on the other side of the window." O'Brien's last meal consisted of a T-bone steak, fries, corn, peas, a salad with French dressing, sweet tea, and a Boston cream pie. On March 31st, 1984, the man who killed Halloween, the Candyman, Ronald O'Brien, was put to death by lethal injection, nearly 10 years after killing his son Timmy. I'm going to read his last words here, and it's kind of a lot. What is about to transpire in a few minutes is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us respectively as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you one and all. God bless you all, and may God's best blessings be always yours. Ronald C. O'Brien. P.S. During my time here, I have been treated well by all the TDC personnel. So yeah, he's really taking a lot of accountability, and he obviously reflected on his actions over the last 10 years. Hundreds of people were gathered outside of the death house. Anti-death penalty supporters were there praying for O'Brien, and some pro-death penalty supporters were there in costumes, waving around pixie sticks. At 12:48 a.m., Ronald O'Brien was pronounced dead, and chants of trick-or-treat came from the crowd outside. Deneen would go on to remarry, and her new husband would adopt her daughter Elizabeth. Deneen reveals that she thinks she was the intended target. Ronald had made an appointment to get Deneen a life insurance policy before Timmy's death, but they couldn't afford to pay the premiums, so it fell through. She never cashed in on Timmy's life insurance policy, calling it blood money. Although he maintained his innocence right up to the end, it was clear what his plan was: poison both of their children and collect their life insurance money. That night, Ronald O'Brien had the pixie sticks shoved into the sleeve of his coat. Not only was he willing to kill his own children, but also risk the lives of 3 others to avoid suspicion. He killed for money. It was premeditated and cold-blooded. To this day, there have been no documented cases of children dying from stranger-given tainted candy. However, the myths and legends live on to this day, and probably always will. I hope that you all enjoyed